Welcome to Deprogram. I'm Michelle Whitty. I am here with Ted Rall, and we are joined by Terry Collingsworth, who is founder and executive director of the International Rights Advocates, which is an organization that is working to end modern slavery through training, research, policy advocacy, and also litigation, which is going to be a lot of what we are talking about in just a second. And the reason that we're having this conversation is that the Wall Street Journal earlier this month ran a story about labor abuses in supply chains, and in particular in textile supply chains. And this is something that we have talked to you about, Terry, a lot, not specifically about textiles, but about big corporations profiting from labor abuses. So the headline of this article was, "To fight forced labor, Shein and Patagonia dig into the atomic makeup of their clothes." And the subhead says, "Apparel makers facing increased scrutiny of their supply chains are turning to forensic companies that can extract a unique chemical footprint or fingerprint from their materials," which is interesting, I guess, because there is, as I understand it, there certainly is plenty of abuse in textile supply chains. There's also, I think, some opacity in textile supply chains. But I had a sense of where this is going. And the story continues and tells us that under pressure to stop goods tied to human rights and environmental abuses from seeping into their supply chains, companies are turning to isotopic testing, which I am told allows them to peer into the atomic makeup of materials in their products. So the idea is, if they have this like tech solution that can tell them exactly where a piece of cotton or a piece of textile came from, then they'll know, I guess, if it was produced using abusive methods. And of course, a principal concern here is whether these goods might have been produced in Xinjiang using forced labor by China's Uyghur population. So this is almost entirely about a 2021 law called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that, from what I understand, just presumes that any product manufactured wholly or partially in the Xinjiang region of China was made with forced labor unless you can prove it otherwise, which is not an assumption that I see being made about goods from other parts of the world, even places where abuse is known to be rampant. Although, Terry, maybe you can tell me if actually this is more common than I know. But I want to stop here and ask a few questions. And one is about this presumption in the story that it is actually really difficult for companies to identify labor abuses within their supply chains. And what they really need are some more high-tech tools. The Wall Street Journal says that companies trying to assess their supply chains are largely stuck verifying documentation susceptible to fraud and inaccuracies. The story quotes an executive from the company Patagonia as saying that when it comes to knowing whether suppliers are using banned materials or not, their information is only as good as the person filling out the document that day. But it does seem like, international rights advocates, and I'm sure others, are able to find plenty of evidence of supply chain abuses in the agricultural industry or the mining industry or the natural gas industry based on visiting suppliers and talking to workers. Mm-hmm. So I want to start there with just like, do we need a tech solution to this problem of finding abuse in supply chains?
Absolutely not. I mean, this just strikes me as a smoke and mirrors solution to try to show that you're really digging down now to find out where that cotton came from. But as you stated, I mean, that's all we do is go to places where things are made and look at them with our eyes, our simple eyes that we've always had, and find abuses all day long. And the funny thing to me about just the whole concept companies complaining about the reliability of their information and so on. They all, just about every one of them, has a code of conduct where they promise you, the consumer, that they don't have child labor, they don't have forced labor.
Hmm.
So I think this just reinforces that that code of conduct is just worthless. It's a public relations device, and that they're doing virtually nothing to verify factually whether such things are true.
Hmm.
They think, and they're largely right, that they need only use their brand name and say, we promise we're not using forced labor, we're not using child labor. Take our word for it. Don't worry, we're a name brand." And that's how the system is operating right now. Every single time I find labor abuses, forced labor, child labor in manufacturing of just about everything you could imagine, the very first thing I do is I reach out to the company and say, "You have a code of conduct that prohibits that. Why don't you work with us and we'll figure out how to fix this situation?" And almost always they lawyer up and just deny that it happened, or lawyer up and say, "Well, technically the law that you're threatening to sue us with doesn't apply here because of this, that, and the other."
Hmm.
And then they go into, legal defense mode instead of keeping the promise that they made. We're never saying you should outlaw child labor. We're saying you said you don't have it. Well, you do. So what are we going to do about it?
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
I wanted to
sorry.
ask about that. Because we've talked about litigation that you've pursued before, and some that went as far as the Supreme Court when we were talking about children who were trafficked to work in coca plantations. And I wanted to talk about that. Like, obviously, these companies, if they wanted to, could pop by their suppliers and check out conditions anytime, but they're not bothering to do that. You go ahead and do that. You bring it to their attention. How often are they really not even bothering to argue that these abuses don't exist within their supply lines, and are just arguing, as you said, arguing that technically this law doesn't apply to us, technically this is the wrong venue, et cetera, et cetera?
It's almost always that they cannot deny the fact of what we have discovered. I mean, let's talk about chocolate for a second. I've been chasing Nestle and Cargill and all of these big chocolate companies for well over 20 years. No one in all of the legal cases we've brought, no company has ever said we don't have child labor. They try to dress it up a little bit and say it's family farms and don't worry about it, but they've never disputed it. We have film showing it. We took CBS into Ghana last year and filmed Mars, Mandalay, and Cargill with massive child labor on their cocoa plantations. So they're not denying it. They're basically saying, try to make us, or you won't be able to sue us because of this technicality. But they've never, ever simply said, "That's not true. I'll prove it to you."
Terry, I know someone very well whose job at a major Portland, Oregon-based shoe company that some people may have heard of. Her job was to supposedly to help check on these supply issues in countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, Malaysia. And she said that the only real problem really was the fact that that it was hard to do an impromptu inspection because these suppliers are often tied in with government agents, so with the government, local government. So it's kind of known. It's hard to do an impromptu check. You can't just show up at the factory gate, wave an ID, be like, "Let me in," because it's like it's sort of like the Red Cross inspecting a POW camp during World War II, right? Suddenly the prisoners all have new blankets and everything looks good. But even so, things were really clear. She said there was never any question that, basically the real defense was, compared to the United States, their salaries and working conditions are terrible, but they're really, really good. These are the best jobs that you could possibly get. That was really the defense, not really that. But I want to ask about the science of this isotopic approach. How does it work theoretically? Like what I don't even get it. Like, what are they saying? Like, what could you tell about, say, Xinjiang labor or the working conditions from this scientific approach? Is it just I mean, just you can just pinpoint the origin, the geographic origin. Is that it?
Yes, but I'd love to comment a little bit on your Oregon company because, that is a common example that they blame the difficulties in the countries where they themselves have chosen to source from, and then they complain like how difficult it is to work there. Well, go somewhere where you can verify the terms under which your products are being made according to your own promises. So that's it's a really false argument. It strikes me that this isotopic approach is extremely limited to the Shenzhen cotton production. I can't think of another law that the U.S. has that limits geographically the importation of products coming from there. So that's the only situation where I think that could or might apply. And that's very limited. There's cotton grown in abusive conditions in India, in Egypt, even in the south of the United States. So I don't think that that's going to get rid of your bad cotton. It's going to get rid of your bad cotton that comes from one place on earth where it's likely that there are labor rights abuses. So I find that just like an amusing sideshow. It's not going to really change the game very much at all. I did once. I spoke on a resolution at the Tesla annual board meeting 2 years ago on child labor and forced labor in cobalt production. And I did challenge Elon Musk with the assertion that, cobalt mining is out in the open and there's a lot of child labor. They're climbing in and out of tunnels. I said, why don't you plant one of your satellites right above all of the mines you're sourcing from? And you could observe that 24/7. You'd know what's going on there. That's a high-tech solution to a problem. And I guarantee you there's no satellites flying over Elon Musk's cobalt mining operations in the Congo because he doesn't want to know what's going on in those mines.
I was thinking about how clearly political I think this sort of Xinjiang ban is, because I looked up one of your cases in the Congo. I don't know if it involved Tesla, or I know it involved like Apple and Google and getting cobalt from Congo DRC. And the courts found against you. And basically they said, well, there's so much labor trafficking in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We couldn't possibly figure out who is actually involved with it. We don't have the perpetrator here. Even the government is involved with it. And it sort of seems like, okay, well, when that situation is allegedly Xinjiang, and you can't possibly sort out what's the good product from the bad product, the solution is let's just put a blanket ban. It seems like when that situation is Congo, the U.S. court solution is, well, we can't possibly do anything about it.
Yes. Well, the court ultimately found that we could not show that Tesla, for example, they were a defendant there, that they had a close enough relationship contractually with the mines they were using to hold them responsible. Now, that would take the whole show to explain why that is nonsense. But I would like everyone to know that we're on the verge of filing a new case against Tesla and Apple, and we've solved that problem. But to your general point, yeah, I think China is just unique. That was a dump on China law. It made everybody feel good because at the time, the Trump administration was trying to play hardball with China. But yeah, it's just a very limited situation. We do have a law, Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930, that is supposed to ban products made with forced labor from anywhere in the world if it's made in whole or in part with forced labor. We have filed petitions under that law involving cocoa, and that then got dropped into the black hole of the politics of Customs and Border Protection, and they didn't do anything at all about it for 4 years.
At the risk of being of whataboutism, does that not, or do they carve out an exception for U.S. prison labor? I mean, that's forced labor.
Yeah, there is an exception. It has to be based in law, and so a lot of our states, Alabama and Texas in particular, use prison laborers, but that's permissible because it's a form of legal punishment. But for the rest of the world, they're supposed to be policing that. And I just sued Customs and Border Protection for taking no action on my cocoa petition after 4 years. And I think the reason is that people at Cargill and Nestle and Mars and Hershey spoke to their friends in the political branch and said, back off. And they did. I can't think of any other reason why they didn't enforce this very, very clear evidence of forced child labor in cocoa harvesting.
Do you get support or opposition from the U.S. government in any of these efforts? Like, does the DOJ, do they file amicus briefs on your behalf ever? Or do they go up against you ever? Like, what's the role of the U.S. government when you're trying to bring these cases to support human rights in a country that supposedly values human rights over everything? Do they get involved at all?
No, they don't help us at all. And I think that that's because whether you're Republican or Democrat, you're still dancing to the tune of multinational corporations with power and money. Um, it should be that they join us. We're trying to enforce the law and prevent human rights crimes. But no, we definitely, I really feel hostility from the government. Um, when I was in Ghana last year filming with CBS News on child slavery and cocoa harvesting, the CBS reporter who was with me, she got a call on her cell phone from the U.S. Embassy in Ghana saying, "I hear you're messing with Cargill. What are you doing on Cargill's property?" That's who the government cared about. They didn't ask me like, "Are you did you find evidence of child slavery? What can we do to help?" They were mad that we were messing with Cargill in Ghana. So,
Yeah.
yeah, there's just no question. In 40 years of experience, I just think that our system is dominated by corporate power, and that goes to the issue of violating law too.
Mm. What do you think of the courts as a mechanism, right, for stopping this abuse? Because they take a long time. There are victories, there are setbacks. I know the Supreme Court case. There are sort of always a sort of technical decision about venue that you have to sort of come back and reroute from. Is the problem that we need? I don't know. Is the problem the interpretation of the law? Is the problem that we don't actually have enough laws to protect human rights in supply chains? Like, what's your perception of the issue here?
Yes, the laws are often drafted by people who aren't litigating with laws at all and aren't anticipating the kinds of interpretation opportunities you're giving to the courts. But the worst experience we've had with courts interpreting statutes to prevent human rights enforcement is with the Alien Tort Statute that we took to the Supreme Court in the Nestle and Cargill case. And the statute at issue, the Alien Tort Statute, it has about 17 words, and it simply says an alien who has suffered a tort in violation of the law of nations shall have a cause of action, something like that. If you're an alien and there's an international law violation that injures you, you can bring a case under this statute. So that was written by the first Congress in 1789. And we started using it in the 1990s. And for a while, we were really getting some traction. And then the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, they started writing amicus briefs to the Supreme Court urging that the statute be interpreted in a way to prevent corporations from being sued in the global economy. And they put forth two arguments. You can't sue a corporation under international law, and that this law does not apply extraterritorially. So the Supreme Court agreed with the second point, and in our Nestle case, they essentially said that in order to sue under the Alien Tort Statute, the majority of, or the essence of the crime had to occur in the United States. Now, that is these Supreme Court conservative justices, they claim to be originalists, and they pasted on to this 16-word statute and a new rule that you have to show that the conduct occurred in the US when it was designed to help aliens who are injured. It just makes no sense. So that was an unanticipated bastardization of what that law actually said by a Supreme Court that was very interested in helping corporate America. Now, as soon as that happened, a number of lawyers working on these issues, we drafted an amendment to that 1789 statute that would have added that the law applies extraterritorially. We couldn't get anybody to take that up for us. People who wanted to basically said, "Ah, oh, don't even bother. We'll never get that through." So we could fix these laws and make them so that judges wouldn't have that wide interpretive leeway to screw us and prevent human rights enforcement. But we need a Congress that will cooperate with us, and I think we're going to wait a while for that, unfortunately.
I was also curious to kind of go back to Ted's reference of, well, in these different parts of the world, these are the best jobs that people can get, et cetera, et cetera. I'm curious how, like, is a blanket ban like the one imposed on Xinjiang, is that actually the best way to prevent labor abuses? I mean, clearly all of this comes down to, what we need is some political will, and what we need is some mechanism to sort of push back against money in politics. But also it does sort of seem like pretty rough for the economy of a region that is under the kind of blanket ban that Xinjiang is under. Like, is that the best way to prevent goods from reaching the United States that have been made with forced labor, right? And in terms of like the consequences being suffered by sort of bystanders, for example, workers in Xinjiang.
Yes. Well, first of all, we have to observe that we have this modern economy here in the U.S. and in Europe, et cetera, and the companies like Nestle or Nike or Tesla, they go to places where there are brutal conditions for workers to lower their costs. Mm-hmm. So it's not like that is the natural progression, that this country has to start from zero and go through 200 years of evolution to finally get to our system. It is that they are leaving our system to go to a place where they can turn back the clock 200 years and abuse workers because there's no basic law enforcement in those countries. Mm-hmm. So the best way for us to manage that, I don't want all those jobs to disappear. I don't think anyone who cares about those workers wants them to have no job. I think, we would need a law that actually, like the one in Shenzhen, but that adds other factors as well, but makes it clear that these four things, child labor, forced labor, horrible working conditions, whatever you want to put in it, those products can't come to the US. And then the question is, what do we make the companies do in order to show that they're not violating those standards? And that's the issue with cocoa, with hand-knotted carpets, with garments that I've been working on for years. We want to see that the companies have to engage in a very transparent, independent verification process so that they have the boots on the ground. They're required to have boots on the ground that are independent to verify the conditions under which they are manufacturing or mining or whatever else. Mm-hmm. So right now, the issue, they're complaining they can't trust their own reports. Well, we need to get an independent system on the ground that could verify the conditions and have access. We helped create a program called GoodWeave. It used to be known as Rugmark, that created an independent organization to verify whether a hand-knotted carpet is made by a child slave in South Asia. And that worked very well because you can't let the chickens be guarded by the fox in the conditions of labor. So we can't trust the companies to tell us one way or another that their products are made in a certain way. We need an independent look at it, groups that can be trusted to verify those conditions. So if I were czar of the universe, I would take that Shenzhen law, add a few more requirements to it, and make it apply to the whole world, and require the companies to demonstrate with an independent verification that they've met the conditions that are prohibited.
And I have a very dumb question, but is that, do you think, more achievable than finding a different specific chemical test to see where every different, entity or every different substance in a product has come from?
Absolutely. Yeah. And they don't want that. They meaning corporate America does not want to be required to verify the conditions under which they're making whatever product it is.
Terry, let me ask you about something in the news now. The President-elect Trump says he wants to impose tariffs on goods that are imported in particular from China. That would obviously include Xinjiang. Would the effect of tariffs be to possibly cause further degradation of workers' conditions in China generally, just because if the exports are more expensive, then therefore they need to get their costs down, or might it have the opposite effect of maybe if the administration now I'm going to have a wild fantasy. President Trump gets on the phone with President Xi and says, we can lift these tariffs if you do better with your working conditions in China. That's not going to happen. But, how do you see the effect of tariffs if they do happen?
Well, I'm not an economist, but those tariffs are not being imposed to improve anything at all. They're just being imposed because Trump thinks that's a way to raise money from some magic process that he's wrong about. I mean, that will raise the price of the good in the US, and that is likely to dampen demand and probably have a negative effect on the number of workers making that product. That's the reality. But yes, I think if you had a president who had the tariff power to use and insisted on requiring improvements in the way things are manufactured or produced, that would work well. We actually have a law called the Generalized System of Preferences Act, which extends, it allows products to come in from developing countries tariff-free if they meet a number of conditions, including recognizing international worker rights in the supply chain. So they have to show that they did comply with internationally recognized worker rights. The problem with that law, which my organization helped enact back in the 1980s, is that whether it's violated is determined by a panel of members of the cabinet of the United States. So someone from commerce, someone from labor, someone from state, they decide whether, when they receive a petition showing that a country has not applied internationally recognized worker rights, whether to cut off this benefit to them. And they've only done it about twice. And they factor in their political relations and who they want to help and who they want to punish. And I'm only aware of a few situations where they actually enforce that law. So it usually comes down to that, whether it's a court or some panel of the administration, that there could be a perfectly well-intentioned law to solve that problem of worker abuse, but it's a weak enforcement process that gets politicized and then nothing happens.
Terry, big general whataboutist question. Is it hard for the United States or for American NGOs to make their case in a credible way internationally when there are so many problems with working conditions, salaries, and so on here in the United States? I mean, we don't really have our house in order very well. I was recently researching the minimum wage, and I was shocked to come across a long list of exceptions to the already rock bottom of minimum wage, not just waiters, but for example, newspaper employees are an exception to the minimum wage. All sorts of people that you just wouldn't think of. And it's like, we're not that great to workers here in this country. You're not really allowed to unionize. You can be fired. I mean, I can go on, but is that an issue?
It certainly is an issue. In my discussions with employers or employer associations in other countries, yeah, we get that all the time. Why don't you go work on your labor problems at home? You have child labor and meatpacking in Kansas and all. Yeah, it is terrible that we're not a better leader by example. And I think that we would have a lot more credibility, both as a nation and as members of the nation, to be critical of other countries. Yes, that's absolutely a problem. And you'd think that we should be able to more easily fix the problems here than abroad. But I will again return to the fact that corporate America doesn't want labor rights enforced anywhere, and they're getting their way. They're winning on that point.
I wouldn't want to keep you too long, Terry, but I did want to ask what, it seems like there's a lot going on at International Rights Advocates. I know you were in Ghana recently. I saw that, I missed this because we had a lot going on, but there was a victory against Chiquita back in the summer. So tell us what you want people to be paying attention to right now.
Well, thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, I think we've been doing this a long time, and a lot of our cases have been, in the hopper for years and years. The Chiquita case, I filed that in 2007,
Hmm.
and various delays. The lawyers for Chiquita tried everything possible to delay it, to get it dismissed. We appealed. So many things happened. But yeah, we got a trial date finally. It started in the end of April, and we did a 6-week trial, and we got a tremendous jury verdict of $38.2 million on behalf of just the first 9 of the 2,451 victims of Chiquita's use of paramilitary terrorists in Colombia. So that's going to go on for a bit more. We're going to figure out a process to try to resolve it. But they've appealed, of course, to avoid paying. But I think we'll win that appeal. But yeah, a couple of things I'd mention for people interested in labor rights, because we've had trouble, like with the Alien Tort Statute getting gutted by the Supreme Court, and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act getting narrowed by the Court of Appeals in our case. We're experimenting now with doing more consumer fraud cases. We've already filed one against Cargill, Mars, and Mondelez for lying about not using child labor in Ghana. We're about to file a new case against Tesla for lying about not having forced labor and other abuses in the cobalt mines. So it really lowers the burden of proof on us. We merely have to show that they've made a misleading or false statement about what they're claiming. So all of those codes of conduct they have that they're not enforcing, talking about all of these companies, they have those codes, and they're complaining, as in the Wall Street Journal article, that they can't rely on the reports they're getting and so on. Well, they better find a better way to do it, or not say it anymore. You can't get away with claiming you're not using child labor, then say how hard it is to verify it, but allowing the consumer to believe you. So we're really going to do a lot more of those consumer fraud cases. And I think the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, I think we plugged the hole in that problem, and we're going to do a lot more there. So I've got a good staff of young lawyers working with me as I'm aging gracefully, and I'm hoping to create a legacy of here's how you do it to the other lawyers, so that we can continue pressing hard on upholding international human rights. And the point I again want to stress is, we are not telling these companies what to do or what their standards are. Our whole mission is to make them keep the promise that they made to the consumers that they're not abusing workers. That should be pretty easy for them to do, but that they must be making a lot of money on abusing workers to fight so hard not to keep their own promise not to do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what it has to be, right? Like, what kind of money do you think we're talking about? What would make it worth it?
Well, in the cocoa area, I would say they've spent about $100 million just defending the cases I've brought. And wow, we could do a lot with that,
Yeah.
So the difference between paying fair wages and paying no wages or very little wages across thousands of workers, yeah, that adds up pretty quick.
Yeah.
This isn't marginal. This is their entire business model. This is how it works. Even, and what's remarkable is when you think about goods that are like manufactured goods, as opposed to, like, say, a digital product, there's tremendous shipping costs involved. And even so in order to make it worth exporting, manufacturing to the other side of the planet and ship them in shipping containers around the world, you can't really pay the locals very much money. You just can't.
That's right.
It doesn't work.
And the company you mentioned, Nike,
Yes,
they were the inventors of this offshoring process, and that we literally in the mid to late 80s chased them around the world. I mean, they went to Taiwan and Korea, then the wages started coming up there, and then they went to Vietnam and Indonesia. Now they're in China and Bangladesh. So that's their business model. Keep running from regulation to save money by abusing labor. And then they charge $200 for a friggin' pair of sneakers that probably cost $10 to make, because they're paying all their money to athletes to sponsor their products. So few people getting rich and thousands suffering the consequences.
And the U.S. government is subsidizing those shipping costs too, through the tax system.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, because I think if they weren't doing that, this wouldn't work. It would all fall apart. They'd have to manufacture in North America.
Yes, you mean that because that's a business expense they can deduct from their income.
Well, yeah, and even
Yeah.
more than that, international shipping companies are directly subsidized, including non-American shipping companies, are like like Evergreen and so on, are directly subsidized by the U.S. government because it's viewed as a national security interest of the United States to have these shipping companies stay in business, even though they're not shipping weapons or anything.
Wow. And we're using our tax dollars to protect them as they go through the Suez Canal.
Yep, that too.
Terry Collingsworth, thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us. It was really great to talk to you again. I hope we get to do it more in the future. Thanks a lot. International Rights Advocates is your organization. It's internationalrightsadvocates.org for anybody who wants to go and find out more, right?
Yes, thank you. Please do check out our website. We have all the updates on our international human rights cases.